to learn more. The Dark Lord rides in force tonight, and time will tell us all. Throw down your plow and hoe, rest not till October. Side by side, we wait the might of the darkest dawn.
The sword, a symbol of might and majesty, at times a beacon of light and a symbol of hope, other times a symbol of fear and a harbinger of dark things to come.
Most of history has been shaped by many things, anything from violent martial conflicts of war to symbolization of perhaps a religion and a religious reason for war. But throughout history, most of what has happened by way of martial arms.
Swordsmanship back in the day, a lot of it goes back to integrity. A lot of duels were put in place to defend someone's honor, or else they were also used for judicial reasons. Your sentence might be you have defense to the death, and if you live, then you're apparently innocent.
Many different philosophies, and there's a lot of conjecture as far as philosophy. Some assumed that the sword was a phallic symbol, which I disagree with. Some people look at the European sword and say it is symbolism of the cross for Christianity. The different philosophies, starting in early times, were might makes right. Kings and queens were not nobility in a manner of speaking. They were the most ruthless and most effective barbarians, and that's how they controlled the territory, by force of might. This is something that shows that I am a noble or I'm a wealthy man. And during certain time periods in Europe, if you were a wealthy man, you were required to have a sword, a dagger, maybe a suit of armor, depending upon your wealth.
The sword's known journey throughout European history goes back to the Bronze Age, thousands of years before the Crusades, or the stories of knights in shining armor or fierce pirates. The oldest sword-like weapons found date back to around 3000 BC. Short blades like the gladius helped to shape the Roman Empire.
Well, fencing itself is probably one of the earliest martial arts. Go back to Sumeria, where about 3000 to 4000 BC, they have records of two gentlemen who were settling a dispute, and they were put in a loincloth and put into a circular pit. They would have one hand that would be tied to the other person, and each one would have a dagger. They were both put into the pit, and whoever crawled out of it alive was the one who won the argument. The European martial arts go back several thousand years before the time of Christ.
As history progressed, the sword drastically changed. Blades went from bronze in the Roman Empire to iron around 13th to 14th century BC. As the Middle Ages came about, the sword advanced greatly as far as forging and material went. Around the 10th century, tempered steel moved to the forefront as standard sword-making material.
In medieval time periods, you were lucky to have a piece of steel that would come together quite well, because you would have to go out into the field and find things like stone hematite, which is an iron ore. You would have to smelt that first and get rid of some of the impurities on it. You would maybe add what you're going to add to it to make your particular form. Blacksmiths had their own formulas. If they had one that was superior, they guarded it jealously. Everybody had their own particular form, and the steel wasn't anywhere near the same grade or controlled as it is now.
Swordsmanship kind of wavered over the years, because you have the more northern countries, Germany, you have Norway and whatnot, Viking style stuff, and it's all very heavy, lots of axes, lots of shields, lots of heavy swords. Scotland, of course, is famous for their very large, full body length claymores. They're compared to a Spanish or English French rapier. It's 5-10 times the weight.
Whereas in the medieval times, you had a wide sword. You had something that would, even if it didn't puncture through the armor or hack the person in half, it's kind of like getting hit with a baseball bat. You could really easily, you could hurt somebody, break the ribs, crack in the skull. Brutal, absolutely brutal. As they got into the suits of armor, the swords got a little bit thinner, so they could get underneath in areas where there were chinks in the armor, literally. Well, then the armor changed, and eventually the armor was eliminated because the swords were so quick and everything else that you couldn't use it. Weapons changed as the need changed.
In modern-day swordsmanship, the use of the blade has moved from mortal combat to sport and reenactment.
Modern fencing differs mostly in the regard that wherein, 100, 200, 300 years ago, a stab to the chest means you're dead, you're going to bleed out, and a stab to the chest in modern Olympic fencing, it's just a point. So it keeps the tradition of swordsmanship going, but it does, it changes the attitude that a lot of people have for it.
We've evolved from using the sword for protection or for aggression to something that is simply a sport, and it is not, in modern version now, it is not even close to the way you would use them to defend yourself, say 300 years ago or 200 years ago. So schools of fencing became quite well known. Capapetto, George Silveri, George Silver. There are several people who headed these schools, and what they did was they would raise these schools, teach their form of fencing as well as martial arts in general that revolved around fencing. And these people developed their own, shall we say, signature moves, and they helped evolve the sword into what it is now, and helped it evolve it into one of the greatest weapons used and one of the longest weapons used through history. We have George Marshall, who is one of the most famous knights and considered to be the finest knight in history. You have many kings were fighters. It was something that if you were very famous, you often were challenged. It's like the top guy, the top gun. You're in top, everybody wants to beat you because then they become top, not realizing that they're going to have probably more people challenge them. That's just life.
From classic literature to the silver screen to the fencing strip to the gaming console, the sword has become prominently embedded in modern and historical culture.
Swashbuckling. I love swashbuckling. I happen to believe that everybody is a closet swashbuckler. When they're kids, they go out into the woods and they grab a stick, a couple sticks, and they're fencing back and forth. A lot of the modern form of swashbuckling we've gotten from a recurrence from the 1940s movies, but the idea was that this was exciting, and so the cinema at that time brought up fencing and reintroduced it into public society as something that was a form of excitement. The old stories of Zorro, you have Robin Hood, things like this. The fencing part was introduced into it to get people interested. King Arthur and the Legend of Excalibur was a very famous sword. There's a lot of different swords and a lot of different swordsmen that we glorify in books and on camera for the movies. Not many of them have anything as far as history goes. Even Shakespeare had several different shows where you would have a lot of great fencing. And these were people that were glorified mostly in the media. Most of the actual fencers didn't have much in the way of actual history that you see on the movies. They have some history in it, but there's no way of verifying it. So consequently, even the story of King Arthur and Camelot was modified through time. So that's, I would think that the most important thing there is, by use of the sword and the representation, is an idea or an ideal that has to be reinforced with a sword or a martial art.
The sword is a symbol of gallantry, conflict, victory, defeat, sometimes divine power, sometimes the will of man, often the righteous will to stand for truth and justice. But most notably, the sword represents the drive to fight for what we value, and the willingness to lay down our lives for the ideals we serve.